Number seven in the seven six. Number six in the works of George Orwell. His memoir of his time in the Spanish Civil War, called Homage to Catalonia. This book came out in 1938 when the war was still going on and its outcome very much in doubt. So it can be seen as political writing that had, at least as one of its motives, the intent to actually affect public opinion in an ongoing struggle. This is the major work of Orwell that fits that category of trying to make a difference in a political cause that was still ongoing. He wrote it. It came out in 1938. He had joined the Spanish Civil War reasonably early in the summer fall of 1936, and he stayed there for almost a year until he was badly wounded. He was shot in the neck and sent behind the lines. This is where he may also have contracted the tuberculosis that eventually killed him. Was when he was in this hospital. He then had to flee Spain because the political unit that he was fighting with was targeted by other elements of the Republican cause. The Republican movement in Spain was a kind of grab bag of moderate centrist to far left elements, and the one that Orwell wound up fighting was called the POUM, P-O-U-M, and they were generally an anarchist militia. The anarchist label at the time probably fit Orwell a little better than formal socialism or communism, since he had not yet sort of fully formed his political sympathies. But this war was a main element in doing so, and it contains several excellent pieces of writing. There's one early on when he talks about meeting just for a moment a young Italian man who had come to the war to fight, and having a couple of words with him and shaking his hand, and just having that shock of recognition moment, the kind that occurs when we are feel ourselves in the middle of great deeds, and when the future sort of has this kind of like deep horizon possibility to us. He had this shock of recognition that what he was fighting for is whether this young man and men like him would have any control or any stake in their own futures, or whether they would forever remain the sort of downtrodden tools of more powerful forces. It's very good. He does not overplay the import of these moments that others perhaps would be tempted to make very melodramatic. He just tries to write as simply as he can these powerful experiences he had. Another one of the most famous bits in the book is when he is in the lines, and there is he's got a gun, and he's watching the fascist side, the Franco supporters, and he sees a man running on the fascist side out of a latrine, and he could take a shot at him, but he doesn't, because this guy hasn't had time to pull up his pants, and the incongruity of trying to kill a man who is in this comical moment sort of stays his hand, and he can't bring himself to fire at him. Although he did fight, and he showed no hesitation at using violence as part of the war effort. He joins this militia. He gets sent to the lines. He serves there over the winter before his wound. Much of the book is excellent description of what it was like to be there and to fight in Spain with people who, lots of good detail on just what it feels like. Details about the food, the dirt, about what it's like to be the foreigner in a cause that is bringing a nation together. Catalonia was very heavily on the Republican side. Catalonia is that area of Spain that has its own language. Catalan centers around the city of Barcelona, and for quite a while had a really strong anarchist movement in general as part of its struggle against the despotic Spanish regimes of the previous generations, Spain had not moved very well towards the kind of liberal democracy that Europe was moving towards. It had a lot of right wing, militaristic leaders, and in response, Catalonia and Barcelona had proved pretty ripe ground for anarchist ideas. One of the best known was the Ferrer schools, or the modern schools, which taught children along anarchist principles, much more along less authoritarian lines, anti-clerical lines. These were quite popular in Catalonia. They taught thousands of students before the Spanish Civil War, and Ferrer himself wound up dying in the war, shot by the Francoists, who Franco, of course, was an ally of Mussolini and Hitler. Although Spain stayed officially neutral during World War II, they gave a lot of sort of indirect aid to the Nazis and the fascists. And many people who, like Orwell, saw war coming between left and right in Europe in the 30s, saw the Spanish Civil War as the first volley, the first, where the blows would actually start to fall, and they saw the struggle for a socialist or leftist, or at least just a democratic Republican Spain, not ruled by a militarized dictator, as vital to the success of more general democratic and leftist causes throughout Europe. So when the Republican movement, when the Francoists did win in 1939, it was deeply disheartening to many on the left. And as the Second World War began, with the early victories by the Nazis and the fascists, many people took it as the arc did not look good. The arc of history looked deeply cruel. So there are some excellent passages of description of what it's like to be in a war in Spain in 1936 and 37. A lot of keenly observed detail of ground and temperature, of the behavior of the Orwell's fellow soldiers and the behavior of the enemy. He has some good passages on how people just fire guns off with some regularity, just kind of to show that they have them. He has a very funny bit about how one of the soldiers on his side kept up more or less a one-man megaphone war against the guys on the other side of the valley, telling them about how great their food was and how warm they all were and how they'd just gotten a fresh shipment of ammunition and this kind of thing. And I don't know, I think I tickled to think of a guy yelling this through a loud hailer across the Spanish valley, like, oh man, this soup sure is great. It's fresh too. It's pretty good. He gives a good picture too. There are passages in the book where he gives a good picture of how life under socialism, which in the first year or so of the Spanish Republic, really seems to have been very romantic, and class divisions really do seem to have collapsed, and people behaved in a very genial, supportive, we're all in it together kind of fashion, whether under the influence of socialism or war or both, you couldn't say, but he had a powerful, he was very drawn to it, and he had numerous examples of how much he enjoyed not seeing all those signs of sort of invidious class distinction and pointless status seeking that troubled him when he was back in the United Kingdom. Another portion of the book that Orwell himself knew weakened the book, but that in some ways has become a very important part of the book, is the attacks by the Communist Party against non-communist leftists. So Orwell was part of an anarchist militia. They were not affiliated with the Communist Party. And the Communist Party, which took its orders from the Soviet Union and ultimately from Stalin, set out to destroy them. In some ways, people said it was more important to them to destroy the non-communist left than it was to win the war. And there is probably some truth to that. Certainly if they had simply made common cause, the war might at least have gone better. It lasted longer. It might have taken Franco a longer time to win out, and perhaps they would even have won. The Soviet Union was the Republican Spain's major source of supply of certain key war materials, because the other nations, which could theoretically have seen the danger of a right wing Spain, chose not to. They were far more concerned about the existence of what they saw as a socialist regime in Europe, and so any help they gave was very indirect, or had to be done against the law, almost. Orwell says that in one of his passages, he says there was this moment in the British Parliament when it was reported that German planes assisting Franco had bombed British ships bringing aid to the Republican forces in Spain, and the conservatives in Parliament cheered. And just what a strange and horrible image that is. Their own ships bombed, and people cheered, because it was understood at this time that there was this unofficial war going on for the soul of Europe, and if you were on the right, if you were a conservative, then the Nazis and the fascists before World War II seemed like the lesser danger, compared to the communist movements and Stalin and so on. And Orwell spent much of his political life looking for space on the left that wasn't dominated by communism and Stalinism in particular, and that would influence all the rest of his work, often very, very directly. He would try to seek out, people in England who he thought were being communist mouthpieces, and expose them so that they would not pass as sort of standard leftists. This to me is so I got all mixed up. Okay, so the communists are attacking the radical leftists, and Orwell knows a lot about this and interrupts his book, which is otherwise a fairly straightforward description of his time in Spain, told first person, very well, very easy to read. He interrupts it with passages about these attacks that he agrees weaken the book because they interrupt the narrative, and they're very, they can be very technical. They can involve, all the, links between this group and that group, and who was working with who at what time. But he said it was important to do it anyway, because innocent men were being framed for crimes they had not committed, and I was in a position to know that and to spread the word on that, and I felt I had to do it. You can see links here too between his opposition to these sort of frame jobs, which, in the Soviet Union, this is the era of those purges where people were made to create, agree to false confessions of treason against the Soviet Union and so on. There's something of this attack on truth, which going on, which he felt compelled to fight against, and which would become perhaps the primary theme of 1984, the idea of an attack on truth itself, and how all events might one day collapse into just competing streams of propaganda, so that you would no longer be able to tell what was true and what wasn't. And so he took a hard line against that position, that some things are true, some aren't. It's important to hang on to that. And in one of his later essays, he talks about the importance on the left of accepting that some things are true, even when we hear about them from people we consider our political opponents. Things still happen, even when, Winston Churchill is the one who tells us they happened. Things still happened. We shouldn't undermine the event just because it's politically inconvenient. We should understand that people who are our political allies are capable of doing horrible things themselves. And this idea, I think, builds into one of his most famous, perhaps his most famous and most widely read single essay, Politics and the English Language, which we'll definitely talk about in due course. Uh, Homage to Catalonia is a fine book. It was not successful in its day. It did not become so until after 1984 and Animal Farm became classics, and sort of all George Orwell generally became books considered worth reading. It is worth reading. It has a lot of that quality of just simply putting you there at a difficult time, not trying to hide the boredom of war, the way you focus on like nominally stupid stuff like bad food, the camaraderie. It reads to some degree like Red Badge of Courage, where these little bursts of violence and the difficulties in knowing what's going on because of the limits of communication of the time. There's a very good passage where he talks about how there was some sort of plan on the part of communist-led movements to wipe out the unit that he was with back in Barcelona. So while they're also fighting the Francoists in the field, they have to keep an eye on the positions they hold, literally hold, like police stations and buildings. He's stationed at one point in an old building in Barcelona with a gun, wondering who the heck he's supposed to defend it from, and how he will tell the difference. And thankfully, this standoff resolves without too much violence. But then the events that take place become twisted by the communist propaganda machine, so that the group he's with, the anarchist group, seems like the instigator and the traitors. And his awareness of the power of sheer propaganda, just the sheer weight of it, and the need to counter it in some fashion. All of this becomes vital to elements of his later work. So it's a fine book. Even the passages where he gets very technical and attempts to correct the record on what happened with the POUM and the non-communist left in Spain, I think are still readable, and very intelligible as a cautionary tale about the difficulty of getting good information about what's going on in wartime, and wondering how to find neutral sources on what is occurring when neutrality itself is sort of breaking down. So definitely worth the read. This is his last major work of nonfiction writing, book-length nonfiction writing. He still has plenty of good essays to come, and we will talk about a few of those. His next major book was his last sort of traditional novel. It was called Coming Up for Air. We'll talk about that next. It came out right before the start of World War II, which Orwell thought might have affected its sales somewhat. But it's a very interesting piece, and it shows what kind of novelist he might have become if he had stayed if he hadn't had tuberculosis, B, if World War II hadn't broken out, if he had stayed trying to write politically and socially conscious work, but in the framework of a fairly traditional novel. This gives you some flavor of what would have resulted. And it's a very interesting book. So next time, Coming Up for Air.